This video has been brought to you together with Skillshare. Now you'll find a link in the video description below with a special deal just for you. It's late in the evening on the 14th of October 2004. An almost empty Bombardier CRJ 200 aircraft with only 2 pilots on board is finding itself in an extremely serious situation. During the climb out, several large pitch inputs have been felt, and right now the aircraft is at its maximum altitude in a fully developed stall on a left-hand bank with over 80 degrees, and both engines failed. But it's not the aircraft or the aircraft systems that have caused this situation. This is the shocking but unfortunately true story of Pinnacle Airlines Flight 3701. Stay tuned. The start of the story that led up to the crash of Pinnacle Flight 3701 actually started earlier during the day of the 14th of October 2004. The accident aircraft, which was a Bombardier CRJ 200, was due to fly from Littlerock over to Minneapolis with passengers on board. But as the flight crew lined the aircraft up on the runway in Littlerock and set takeoff thrust, they got an ACAS message. And the ACAS message had to do with the right-hand engine bleed air system. So the crew aborted the takeoff, they taxied back into the apron in Littlerock, and they called for some engineers. And the engineers were struggling initially to find the issue with the engine, so they called in some more mechanics to help them. Meanwhile this was going on, the passengers was redirected onto a different flight, so took them over towards Minneapolis. So this meant that after a few hours, when the tiny little fault had been found and rectified, the aircraft was still sitting on the apron in Littlerock. But the airline needed that aircraft to fly the following day out from Minneapolis, so they now needed to get that aircraft over to Minneapolis. So they called in a standby crew. The crew that was called out to operate the flight consisted of a captain, was 31 years old, 6,900 hours of total time and 973 hours on the CRJ 200. He was happily married, family man, with mostly good training comments. Together with him was a 23-year-old first officer. He had been flying for Pinnacle for just over 6 months at the time. He had 761 hours of total time, 222 on the CRJ 200, and he was described as a really happy and positive person who was very happy with his position in Pinnacle. Both of the pilots were flown in as passive crew members on a flight from Detroit. They arrived at Littlerock about 20:36 in the evening, and they were both described to be in a good mood, well rested by people who met up with them on the ground. And according to the captain's wife, these 2 pilots had not flown together before. Before we go any further, I just want to point out a little bit about these type of positioning flights. So they are quite rare, obviously, because the airline doesn't like to fly around with empty aircraft. And because of that, there's always a bit of feeling of doing something special when you're operating a positioning flight. There's no cabin crew on board, there are no passengers on board, and because of that, you also as a pilot have to do some extra stuff, like you have to operate the air stairs if you have any. You have to make sure that the galleys are secure, that there are no trolleys moving around, and you need to arm the forward slides in case of an evacuation. There are very rarely any time pressures on a positioning flight. Like in this case, for example, the crew just needed to get the aircraft over towards Minneapolis to be used the following day. And because of that, it's likely that it was a quite good and kind of festive spirit to the operation. Other things that you also need to remember is that when you're operating an empty flight like this, the aircraft doesn't handle like it normally does. You're much lighter, so the performance is going to be different. It's going to be able to do things that it normally cannot do. Knowing this actually poses some quite significant threats, because the way that you operate an aircraft needs to be exactly the same no matter if you're operating with or without passengers or cabin crew. Okay. That's just to keep in mind. The crew received their briefing material, their flight plans. They were planned to climb up to a cruising altitude of 33,000 feet, and the weather along the route looked nice with only a partially covering cloud layer on the departure airport, but getting clearer as they moved northbound. At time 21:21, the CRJ 200 took off from Littlerock Airport, and almost immediately it was apparent that this aircraft was not being flown the way it was supposed to be. Because only 5 seconds after takeoff, at an altitude of about 450 feet, the first out of several very large pitch-up inputs came from the cockpit. The first one caused a lateral G loading of 1.8 Gs. It pitched the attitude up to 22 degrees nose up and caused a 3,000 feet per minute climb. This was then really quickly followed by a stick shaker event and then a stick pusher event, as in when the aircraft is pushing the nose forward. That was followed by full forward inputs on the yoke, which leveled the aircraft off and caused a lateral loading of about 0.6 G. Now, there was no indication of why this happened, because unfortunately there was no cockpit voice recorder data saved from this beginning of the flight. But from the flight data recorder, we know that this was the first out of 3 such inputs, which we'll get to in a second. The aircraft continued to climb, and at time 21:25, so about 4 minutes after takeoff, as the aircraft reached about 14,000 feet climbing, the autopilot was engaged. And after that, both transcripts from air traffic control and flight data recording shows that the pilots now swapped seats. So this means that the captain moved from the left seat to the right seat, and the first officer moved over to the left seat. Why? We don't really know, but what we do know is that shortly after this, the autopilot was disconnected and a second pitch-up command was recorded from the cockpit. This time they pulled 2.3 Gs of vertical loading that gave a climb rate of about 10,000 feet per minute. The aircraft continues to climb, and just after this, there is recordings of left and right cyclical movements of the rudder. So they started to the left, then right, then left, then right again. This gave some side loading to the aircraft, well within the performance limits of the aircraft, but definitely not something that you would have ever felt as a passenger, and not something that you would normally do. Anyway, the crew continues to climb, and at 24,600 feet, the last pitch up input is being felt. This time is a 1.87 G loading, and that gives about 9,000 feet per minute in climb rate. This is indicative of pilots that are kind of testing things out. Right? They're doing stuff now that they would never do when they have passengers or cabin crew on board, kind of testing the limits of what the aircraft can do. The aircraft now continues to climb up to their planned cruising altitude of 33,000 feet. But somewhere around here, the flight crew decides that it would be a good idea to see if they can climb up to the maximum certified ceiling of the CRJ 200, which is 41,000 feet. So they contact air traffic control, they request flight level 410, and air traffic control sees that there's no traffic above them, so they clear them up to this level. Somewhere around here is also where the cockpit voice recorder transcripts start recording. So from here, we know that the pilots were kind of giggling, right? They were in a festive mood in the cockpit. There are a lot of expressions like, oh man, oh bro, let's 41 it, I can't believe we're this high, it looks kind of normal though, and a lot of laughter and things like that. Definitely indicating that the mood in the cockpit is different than it would be on a normal commercial flight. The autopilot mode that the pilots are using to climb up to 41,000 feet is going to become really important to this story. They're using a mode called vertical speed. And what vertical speed does is kind of like the name implies, it maintains a certain climb rate, a certain vertical speed. This is a mode that we normally use very, very rarely when we are operating at high altitude, because it will climb with that vertical speed, and it will sacrifice speed in order to maintain that vertical climb rate. And this is exactly what happens. So from around 37,000 feet or so, the pilots input 500 feet per minute climb rate. Maintaining that climb rate is fine, providing that the thrust from the engines can sustain it, okay? Because the auto throttle will move the thrust to full thrust. And then it will maintain 500 feet per minute. And if the thrust is not enough, the speed will start decaying. And this is exactly what happened. They started with a speed of 203 knots, which is Mach 0.63. And as they kept climbing, the speed kept creeping lower and lower and lower. So as they reached 41,000 feet, the speed was now at 163 knots and Mach 0.57. Now, why is this important? Well, this turns out to actually be the most dangerous thing that they've done so far. Because if you know your aerodynamics, you know that as the speed keeps going slower and slower, if you want the aircraft to continue to fly, the angle of attack of the wing, as in the angle that the wing is having against the oncoming air, needs to increase. You need to have more and more angle of attack in order to create the same kind of lift with lower speeds. However, when you do that, the pressure difference between the lower part of the wing and the upper part of the wing will increase, and that will increase those vortexes that are being created at the wingtips. Now, those vortexes also comes with something called induced drag. So what this effectively means is that as the aircraft keeps going slower and slower, especially at high altitude where the air is really thin, this induced drag will become bigger and bigger, and the aircraft might end up in a situation which we pilots refer to as being at the back of the drag curve. Essentially, that means that as the aircraft goes slower, the drag will increase, so it will go even slower, and it will go slower and slower. And unless you have enough engine thrust to pull yourself out, to accelerate the aircraft, to reduce that drag, well, the aircraft will eventually stall, right? It will not return to this speed by itself. And another issue you have when you're up at these altitudes is that the air is so thin that the engine thrust is greatly reduced, right? The engines will not be as effective up there. So we are really, really careful when we operate at higher altitudes because of this. Right? This is something that we are constantly looking out for when we are climbing, and that's why vertical speed is a mode that can be very dangerous. And in fact, this is probably the most dangerous things that I've done up until this point, even though all of the other things that they've done is much more spectacular. The pilots of this flight doesn't seem to recognize this issue. Instead, they are really amped about having joined the 41K club. They are discussing this forth and back and how cool it is. And they're also at this point being changed over from one air traffic controller over to the other. The new air traffic controller asks them what aircraft type they're flying. And when they respond that they're flying a CRJ 200, the air traffic controller basically responds, "Oh, I've never seen you guys up that high before." And the captain responds to that with, "Well, we don't have any passengers on board, so we decided to have a bit of fun and come up here. And this is actually our service ceiling." So that kind of highlights that there was no operational reason for the crew to climb up to 41,000 feet. The only reason they did so was because they wanted to try something out, to join the 41K club. The captain asks the first officer if he wants something to drink. The first officer makes some jokes about checking if the liquor cabinet is locked, but then he asks for a Pepsi. The captain goes to prepare the Pepsi for the first officer. When he comes back, it seems like he's starting to realize that this is not a good position they're in, because he says, "We're losing here. We're gonna come down in seconds, and this thing ain't gonna hold the altitude, is it?" And the first officer responds with, "It can't, man. We kind of greased it up here, but it won't stay." What this indicates is exactly what we were talking about before. They're now so far back on the drag curve that even though the thrust is set to maintain the speed and the altitude, the speed just keeps decelerating, and this is what they're seeing on the speed tape. At 21:54, the captain contacts air traffic control and asks them to get a lower altitude, maybe flight of a 390 or 370. But only seconds after he calls, the first stick shaker event happens as the aircraft reaches 150 knots of indicated airspeed. This is then followed by 4 other stick shaker events and 4 stick pusher events. For each of these, every time that the stick pusher is activated, the nose is pushed down in order to gain airspeed, but almost immediately after that, the nose is then being pulled up again to maintain the altitude. This has, as a consequence, that the speed just keeps going lower and lower and lower, and the attitude of the aircraft, the angle of attack, is getting higher and higher. And the highest indicated attitude was 29 degrees nose up at 41,000 feet. When that happened, on the 5th stick shaker and 4th stick pusher, the aircraft goes into an aerodynamic stall. As that happens, both engines 1 and engine 2 flame out almost simultaneously, and the aircraft goes into a bank with the left wing low. It banks as much as 82 degrees left and pitches down with 32 degrees nose down. In the following 14 seconds, the pilots are inputting on the controls and manages to get the aircraft under control, but they're losing 7,000 feet in the process. During the recovery procedure, the captain had time to call air traffic control. He said, "We're declaring an emergency standby," and then he's focusing on the first officer's actions in the left-hand seat. Air traffic control comes back and gives them a clearance to descend 24,000 feet, which the captain acknowledges. As this is happening, the ADG, the air-driven generator, which is similar to a RAT, a ram air turbine on Airbus, is being deployed into the airstream. We can hear that on the cockpit voice recorders because it makes quite a lot of noise in the air. And about 20 seconds after the initial stall, someone in the cockpit calls out, we don't have any engines, and the captain responds with dual engine failure. This is then quickly followed by the captain starting to action the dual engine failure checklist, which has some memory items in it. One of those memory items is to make sure that the airspeed of the aircraft doesn't go below 240 knots. Now, that's not very clearly written in the checklist. It just says airspeed 240 knots. It doesn't clearly specify that that's the minimum. And this is going to be one of the changes that will come out of this accident eventually. Because as they're descending now, they're not maintaining 240 knots. They're maintaining a lower speed than that, between 170 and 200 knots indicated. The dual engine failure checklist tells the crew to, if they're between 21,000 feet and 13,000 feet, to consider a windmill start. And the beginning of that checklist is that you need to maintain 240 knots, stabilize yourself there, and when you're ready to try to windmill start the engines, as in using the airflow from the speed of the aircraft to turn the engine components in order to start them, you need to pitch the aircraft forward in order to achieve an airspeed of at least 300 knots indicated. So the captain is reading this out and he's telling the first officer to pitch forward. All right, give me 300 knots, pitch forward more. The first officer does so, right? He pitches the aircraft forward with about 5 degrees nose down. But every time that he does so, he continues to pitch the aircraft up again. So the highest speed that the aircraft reaches throughout this maneuver is 236 knots, which is lower than the minimum 240 needed. And you will understand why this is so important later on in this video. Now, as the captain is dealing with the dual engine checklist, the cabin altitude alert goes off. Because the way that the pressurization system is built in modern airliners is that it uses bleed air from the engines to pressurize the aircraft. And of course, if you've lost both engines, it means that there is no bleed air available now to pressurize the cabin. So as they're dealing with the checklist now descending, the cabin altitude has been steadily increasing until they're now in a position where they need to put the masks on. There's a little bit of ambiguity in the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder about when they actually put the masks on, but they did put the masks on during this time. With all of this going on, the captain continues to insist that the first officer lowers the nose to get the speed up, but it doesn't really happen and the captain doesn't push for it any further than that. The aircraft is now descending through about 29,200 feet, and up until this point, the electrical power has been supplied by the air-driven generator, the ADG. But at this point, and following the dual engine failure checklist, the captain decides to switch on the auxiliary power unit, the APU. And that's important because the APU will be able to provide full electrical power to the aircraft, and also, crucially, it will be able to provide pneumatic power in case the windmilling start is unsuccessful and they need to do an APU-assisted restart attempt later on. I also want to point out at this point that the aircraft is almost at 30,000 feet, and even if they don't have two engines, at 30,000 feet they have a quite good gliding distance. Okay, they have a large area around them which they could reach given the speed and the altitude they have, and within the gliding distance they have about 6 airports at this point. Now, this serves as a good reminder that if you ever find yourself in a situation like this, if you're a pilot, dividing the roles in the cockpit is really important. The pilot flying in a situation like this has to assume the worst, namely, we have lost both engines, we might not be able to restart them, so what is my plan going to be? And communicate with air traffic control, point towards an airport that is within your obvious gliding distance, probably keep yourself a little bit high, and just aim for that. Start preparing plates, start briefing yourself quietly in order to be able to get into one of these airports. Now, the pilot monitoring on the other side needs to focus on running through the checklist accurately, trying to get at least one of the engines started. Because if they manage to start one engine, they will have a lot more options and a lot more time available. But in this case, this crew seems to be fully focused on just trying to start up the engines, right? The first officer is maintaining a largely northerly, northeasterly heading, and there's no discussions going on about which airports to go to, nor are they talking to air traffic control and giving them any kind of indications on how severe this problem is. But at this point, air traffic control actually calls the aircraft up and asks them what their status is, what kind of failure and emergency they're actually declaring. Because remember, up until this point, they've only declared an emergency, and they've also told air traffic control to stand by, which means that air traffic control is going to assume that they're really busy and they're working on the checklist and are unlikely to come in and, potentially interrupt them. But here air traffic control thinks that the timing, it's been too long, they need to know a little bit more about what's going on. So they ask them, and the captain comes back, and what the captain says is that, we've had an engine failure up here and we're now trying to descend to restart the other engine. This is not true, right? Yes, they have had an engine failure, but they've also had a second engine failure. And the difference between an aircraft that is flying on one engine, wanting to restart the other, and an aircraft flying without any engine is huge. One is an immediate emergency, the other one is a well under control situation. So the controller comes back and said, understand, controlled flight on one engine, and there's no response back from the captain to that question. As the aircraft continues to descend now, the captain tries to restart the engines using the APU. He does 4 separate restart attempts, 2 on each engine, all of them unsuccessful. The N2 rotation is stuck at 0. It does not move whatsoever. And as they're now getting closer to 13,000 feet, they ask for further descent from air traffic control. Air traffic control comes in and asks them, do you need to land? And the captain just responds that, no, we're still trying to restart this engine. So at this point, as low as 13,000 feet, air traffic control still does not know that they're dealing with an aircraft that doesn't have any engines. And the captain still seems like he's trying to obscure the fact that they have put themselves in this situation. At time 22:08, the captain is heard on the cockpit voice recorder saying, switch. The first officer responds with, yeah. And then there is some reshuffling sounds on the cockpit voice recorder indicating that the pilots are now switching back to their original seats. So the captain goes into the left seat again, the first officer into the right seat, and from this point onwards the captain is in control of the aircraft and the first officer is handling the checklist and talking to air traffic control. And when the first officer calls up air traffic control, the first thing he does is to declare that they're actually having a dual engine failure and that they need vectors towards the closest airport immediately. As the aircraft is passing about 9,000 feet now, with air traffic control well aware about what's going on, the crew is asking for help to get towards the closest available airport, and that is identified as Jefferson City, which is just straight ahead. The problem is, though, that even though Jefferson was within gliding range when they were at 30,000 feet and when they were at 20,000 feet, since they've been maneuvering, since they've been trying to restart the engines and haven't focused on maintaining the best gliding speed, which would have been 170 knots, Jefferson City is now outside of the gliding range, but they haven't really found that out yet. They haven't noticed that yet. Instead, the first officer is asking air traffic control to get the frequency for the tower of Jefferson City, also for the ILS frequency, so that they can tune that. And at this point, they're still in cloud. Okay, the cloud layer overhead Jefferson City is about 5,000 feet. So they're continuing to descend now. The captain is asking for vectors to turn to establish themselves on the center line, which they eventually do. But when they break out of clouds at about 5,000 feet, then the captain asks where the runway is. The first officer sees the runway, points it out to the captain, and the captain states, "We're not going to make this runway. And is there a road or something?" They look around themselves, they see a straight line of lit highway a little bit to the left, so the aircraft depart from the runway center line in Jefferson City and turn towards this highway. At time 22:14:46, the captain is heard on the cockpit voice recorder saying, let's keep the gear up. I don't want to go into any houses here. Now that shows some significance to me, because as a pilot, I know that if you are to make an emergency landing on solid ground, getting the gear out is crucial in order for the gear to absorb some of the impact forces. And the fact that they choose not to do that, to extend their glide, to try to avoid houses, shows that the captain is now focused on trying to avoid casualties on the ground. The last thing that is heard on the cockpit voice recorder is, "We're going to go into houses." And then there are several ground proximity warning system alerts, followed by the impact noises at 22:15:06. The aircraft clips a few trees and a garage before it impacts the ground inside of a populated area. It flips over and bursts into flames as it lands. Both pilots are lost in the impact, but fortunately there are no injuries to any persons on the ground. The aircraft investigation team was very quickly on site at Jefferson City, and they started to try to gather up data and information about what could have caused this. And very quickly they could find the undamaged cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder. And from that, they were able to build a pretty clear picture of what had been going on. Obviously, the main focus was on the way that the pilots had acted up until they stalled at 41,000 feet. But there were a few questions that needed to be answered. One, why did the pilot flying, the first officer in this case, act the way he did when he was confronted with the stall warnings? Number two, why did the aircraft's engines flame out as the aircraft stalled, and why were they not able to get the engines running again? Now, we're going to get into the technical aspects of this just after this message from my sponsor. I also want to take a few seconds here to say a special thank you to the sponsor of this episode, which is Skillshare. Now, I know that you are watching this because you are a curious person, a lifelong learner, someone who constantly wants to improve and understand the world around you better. And in that case, Skillshare is definitely something that you should be checking out. Okay, they have thousands of high-quality video courses and pretty much anything that you can imagine. A course that I'm using myself at the moment is 5 Minutes Creativity with Jasmine Cheyenne, where she gives kind of hands-on tips on how to chisel out a few minutes to be creative every single day. And it's something that I personally really need. But there are also courses in, storytelling, creative photography, or even how to use your own home simulator to improve and prepare before you start your private pilot license. So if you think, Peter, that sounds amazing, well then the 1,001st of you guys who clicks on this link here below will get 1 month of premium Skillshare absolutely for free. So click the link and start exploring your curiosity today. To answer the first question about why the first officer acted the way he did when confronted with the stall warnings, they had to go back to the training organization at Pinnacle Airlines. And it was very clear from the training organization that the way that the crews were being trained to handle impending stalls was to avoid getting into a fully developed stall. So to use the stick shaker or the onset of vibrations as a first indication of stall, and to act accordingly, to try to get the aircraft out of stall, increase the speed, decrease the angle of attack as soon as possible. But what also became clear to the investigation team was that this type of training was very rarely done at high altitudes. It tended to be done at around 10,000 feet in different configurations, and a lot of the emphasis on these type of training was to try to both rectify the stall situation, as in getting the airspeed up and getting the angle of attack down, but also to minimize altitude loss. And this was common in the entire industry at the time of the accident, that it was kind of thought that stalls would mainly happen as the aircraft was part of the approach traffic circuit, and therefore terrain would be a major issue. So once the immediate stall threat was solved, well then altitude loss needed to be minimized. And also at around 10,000 feet and below, the engines are very powerful. The engines have the possibility to almost pull an aircraft out of a stall. That's not what happens at 41,000 feet, where the engines have very little excess thrust available. So as a consequence of this accident, airlines all over the world started to practice more high altitude stalls and to emphasize on the importance of really getting the nose down and keeping the nose down until the speed has recovered, using the engines nice and slowly and smoothly to get the speed up, and only once the speed is back up and the aircraft is unstalled can you start thinking about regaining altitude, not before then. Now this brings us then to the issues with the engines, and when it comes to why the engines actually flamed out, that was fairly easy to figure out, because the aircraft was in such an extreme position at 41,000 feet with a pitch attitude of 29 degrees and a really low speed. What actually happened was that the airflow going into the engines was severely disrupted. This led to compressor stalls and basically not enough air being pumped into the combustors in order to sustain the flames. So the flameout of both of these engines came from the extreme attitudes that the aircraft found itself in during the upset. But this still doesn't explain why the engines wouldn't restart, right? It's one thing if they flame out, but if you're at 41,000 feet, you should have ample time to both try to windmill restart the engines and then later on use the APU to start it. But in this case, no matter what the flight crew was doing, the N2, the high pressure compressor and turbine just would not move, right? N2 was stuck at zero, and no matter what they did, it wouldn't turn. Why is this? Well, when the NTSB asked the engine manufacturers, they found out that these particular engines, the CF34-1 and 3 engines, had issues with the in-flight engine starting procedure during certification testing. Namely that if the engine core was allowed to wind down to zero, it could face something called a core lock. And what a core lock basically is that it has to do with an air seal inside of the high pressure turbine. Now this air seal, it directs airflow and cooling inside of the engine. And because it does that, it has to be really tight. And the way it's constructed is it has a rotating part and a static part. Now the rotating part has some teeth in it that grinds little grooves in the softer static part around it. And generally during normal engine operation, the margins are really tight. Now what can happen if the engine is running at a really high temperature and then suddenly gets cooled down is that the softer surrounding static material will cool down quicker than the rotating part of the air seal. And when that happens, the rotating part can move outside of those grooves that it has been grinding and into new material in the soft material. And at the same time, the softer material, since it's cooling down quicker, is contracting around the rotating part, greatly increasing the friction inside of the engine. if the N2 rotation, so the high pressure part inside of the engine, is allowed to come to a complete stop, this can actually lock the engine up until the internal components have cooled enough for them to release from each other. And this is why, remember how I said earlier in the video that it was so important that the airspeed was kept at the minimum of 240 knots? Well, that's because at 240 knots there is enough air running through the core of the engine to keep this air seal rotating while it's being cooled down. Then, as it has cooled down properly and you restart the engine, you will not have a problem. But as you know, on this particular occasion, since the pilots had forced the aircraft up to 41,000 feet and allowed the airspeed to come down that slow, it meant that the engines were operating at almost full power, heating them up greatly without getting much cooling air running through the core. So one of the engines was actually operated 300 degrees outside of its red line maximum temperature. The other one was just below the red line. And when the pilots finally got the aircraft into that upset where there were 29 degrees and the aircraft stalled, well then the engines would have been red hot and then suddenly flamed out, cooling down really quickly since they're at the really cold temperatures that we have at 41,000 feet. Then the aircraft was descending down at a lower speed, allowing this core lock to occur. And this is what happened. These engines were completely locked up. It didn't matter what the pilots did after that point. They wouldn't start rotating. The only thing that would have allowed them to start rotating was more time to let the internal components cool down sufficiently so that they release from each other, and then they would have been able to restart the engines. Now, because of this, there was an airworthiness directive sent out to all of the users of the CF34 engines to let them know about this potential for core locks in certain situations. And there was also mandates from the FAA to General Electric to try to update the way that these air seals were constructed to minimize the risk for core locks like this to happen in the future. So this just brings us to the end of the final report and what the NTSB deemed to be the probable cause of the accident. The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable causes of this accident were 1. The pilot's unprofessional behavior, deviation from standard operating procedures and poor airmanship, which resulted in an in-flight emergency from which they were unable to recover, in part because of the pilot's inadequate training. 2. The pilot's failure to prepare for an emergency landing in a timely manner, including communicating with air traffic controllers immediately after the emergency about the loss of both engines and the availability of landing sites. And 3. The pilot's improper management of the double engine failure checklist, which allowed the engine cores to stop rotating, resulting in the core lock engine condition. Contributing to this accident were 1. The core lock engine condition, which prevented at least one engine from being restarted, and 2. The airplane's flight manuals that did not communicate to pilots the importance of maintaining a minimum airspeed to keep the engine cores rotating. I know that this video might stir up some feelings in you, feelings like anger, disappointment, shock and awe. That's not the reason I chose to make this video. I chose to make this video because it highlights a really important point, which is how important it is to stay professional no matter what kind of situation you find yourself in. Even if you are in a position where no one will ever find out how you were operating or what you were doing, it still might have impact, it still might have consequences. So try to stay as professional as possible. Also, there are some really important learning points in this video regarding high altitude operations, aerodynamics, and also some technical systems. And this is always why I make these videos, right? Every one of these videos in my series about aviation accidents and incidents, which you can see more of up here, I will try to highlight something that is really important, something that made the aviation world a bit safer after the accident, even though it might have been really, really tragic when it happened. And I hope that you find these videos interesting and that they teach you something, even if you're not in the aviation industry. And if you do, then please share these videos on social media, but also make sure that you have subscribed to the channel and that you've highlighted the notification bell so that you know whenever I send out new videos. I hope that I get to hear from you inside of the Mentour Aviation app or inside of my Discord server. If you want to buy one of these t-shirts that I'm wearing, well then I have several of them available in my Teespring store. There are links here below the video or in the video description as well, and everything of the proceeds that comes from you buying these t-shirts will go to the channel and to my work with increasing the quality. And if you want to be part of the real core team, the people that really have influence on what happens on the channel, suggestions, feedback on my videos, well then join my Patreon crew. I have weekly hangouts with my Patreon crew where we discuss what's going on in the world and in their lives and also what's happening on the channel, and they have the chance to discuss feedback about videos and stuff with me. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.